This is Something to Gnaw On, and I'm your host, Nate Vinio. This is Season 3, and we're reading through a book on shepherding, on leading God's people, called Insights of Pastoral Significance. Today we will cover the last 4 of the do's and don'ts of shepherding. Next episode we'll wrap up the Peter paradigm with Chapter 4, and the following episode will start Part 2 of the book entitled The Saul Syndrome. Let's dive into the last of the do's and don'ts for God's shepherd. Number 4, don't be motivated by greed. There are some subjects that are just tough to preach about. Hot buttons, we call them. One touch and there's an explosion. Peter's paradigm for ministers involves 2 of them: financial ethics and abusive leadership. First, let's look at what Peter had to say about eagerness to have versus eagerness to serve. While many churches in Peter's day were poor, it appears there was money to be had in other churches. And while Paul taught that elders have the right to adequate financial support, i.e., 1 Corinthians 9, 6 through 12, both he and Peter warned against the love of money. Like an archer selecting his sharpest arrows, Peter chose the Greek word aiskakerdo to describe his motivation. It meant an eagerness for base gain. The root aish refers originally to that which is ugly and disgraceful. In other words, Peter means shameful or dishonorable gain. From New Testament times to the present, shameful gain has been a troublesome issue in the church. An early church document, the Didache, 90 to 100 A.D., endorsed financial and material support for prophets who lived among the brethren, chapter 13. But it also provided that, quote, if he, a visiting prophet, asks for money, he is a false prophet, end quote. Quote, to take the cure of souls only because there is a good living in the family, or for a livelihood, or because it gives position and influence, is a sacrilege that will entail a terrible reckoning for the hireling shepherd, end quote. F.B. Meyer. Quote, which, if it, sordid gain, be the motive of acting, is filthy beyond expression. O consider this, ye that leave one flock and go to another, merely because there is more gain, a large salary. End quote. John Wesley. As repulsive as a shepherd with such motivation is to outsiders, providing some with stones to throw at the church and others with a stone of stumbling, the sheep are the big losers. Quote, all this greed unfits us for our task. It destroys the fine sense of the shepherd. It destroys his perception of the needs and perils of the sheep. Not only do the funds given by the sheep, perhaps sacrificially, disproportionately flow to the shepherd, but their own needs go unnoticed week after week. And this is the very setting that God established for their care. Number 5, do be eager to serve. Before Peter addresses his next hot button, abusive leadership, he inserts an admonition that pastors be eager, prosthemos, to serve their congregation sacrificially. In other words, they should not have an itch to get, but an eagerness to give. Quote, eagerness is the zeal that is sacrificial and without any thought or calculation of self-gain. End quote. It is a stronger word than voluntarily, and it's made up of 2 Greek words, pro, meaning prior, and thumos, a passion, a boiling up. It means, quote, anticipating with attentiveness and eagerness the demands that may be made, end quote. This kind of leadership, quote, focuses more on helping others than commanding them. It is a life given over to service, end quote. Number 6, don't be domineering. Pastors are grieved when a husband justifies being domineering by quoting Paul's words, quote, wives, submit to your husbands, end quote. They want to say, read the rest of the passage. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church and gave himself up for it. In 1 Peter 3:5, the apostle is dealing with similar scenarios, except the offense is committed by leaders upon a congregation under the banner of scriptures such as, quote, submit to those in authority over you, and, quote, touch not the leader's anointed, end quote. Like the abusive, Bible-quoting husband, this pastor has failed to love as Jesus does. He does not comprehend the spirit of Christian leadership, but he does know how to intimidate people by quoting scriptures out of context. Jesus emphatically told his disciples, including Peter, they must not lord it over the people as was commonly done by worldly leaders. Matthew 20, verses 25 and 26. The reason for the rebuke was that they had shown a proclivity for just such behavior, and this could not be tolerated in the church. Realizing how deeply in fallen human nature it is rooted, Peter repeats Jesus' warning to the elders. So what exactly is lording it over? Peter used the word katakuriano, which spoke of control and subjugation of others, and bringing others under one's power. Its impropriety in ministry is glaring. 1. Quote, the prefix kata clearly has a negative force and implies that the princes of this world exercise their rule to their own advantage and contrary to the interest and well-being of the people, end quote. The New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. 2. Quote, it, katakuriao, is not only intensive, it implies something of scorn and tyranny or even hostility, end quote. Pulpit Commentary. 3. Quote, lording it over others represents a domineering spirit and is contrary to the very nature and purpose of the pastoral relationship, end quote. Pulpit Commentary. 4. It is, quote, viewing others as underlings and yourself as the boss, end quote. Charles Swindoll. 5. It means, quote, ruling to your own advantage, end quote. Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. 6. Quote, he implies that leaders should govern not by the use of threats, emotional intimidation, or flaunting of power, nor by the use of political power within the church, end quote. Grudem. The need to control is rooted in the pursuit of personal significance so promoted in the world. Naturally, this produces the opposite of servanthood, extreme selfishness and aberrant behaviors. Quote, authoritarian people often suppose their superior office proves they are inherently superior individuals. This is why they lord it over others. They assume they have a natural right to do so. Do control issues exist among Christian leaders? Check out Diotrephes, 3 John 9 and 10, the leader of the local church. Possessed by a consuming desire for preeminence in the church, Diotrephes refused to receive the message the Apostle John had sent, threatening his own church members with excommunication if they took them into their homes. In other words, he had extreme ego needs. Carnality personified, Diotrephes is mirrored today by many in the church who exhibit a similar lust for power. It is amazing that these are admitted to the ranks because they seem to be, quote, natural leaders. Quote, Christian organizations often ignore this principle. Along comes a man with natural leadership traits. Sure, he's a bit arrogant. He likes to control. Maybe he's a bit overbearing at times, but so what? He has leadership, so he gets authority in the organization. The result? Wounded people. Another writer puts it this way, quote, without love for Christ and people, ministry easily turns into uncontrolled ego gratification and a grasping need for preeminence and control. then a pastor is in danger of becoming a pontificating religious quack." End quote. Just how serious the problem is can be seen from one denomination's survey of its churches. A 2006 survey by the Southern Baptist Church Minister Relations Association reported 680 pastors and 265 staff members were forced out of the ministry that year. Control issues topped the list of causes. Poor people skills on the pastor's part, the pastor's leadership style being too strong. Number 7. Do lead by example. Rather than controlling their sheep, shepherds are to lead by tupos, example. Tupos is an impression made by a blow, i.e., an exact copy. In Roman and Greek, philosophical tradition teachers are living examples of their teaching. If the flock is to survive fiery trials victoriously, as well as live Christ-like in a pagan society, shepherds must show them how by their example. The Apostle Paul gave a young pastor named Timothy the same charge, quote, "Let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself an example to those who believe." 1 Timothy 4:12. Instruction from the pulpit is not the end of a pastor's teaching responsibility, no matter how eloquent and persuasive. Telling is the easy part. Showing is another matter. Whether we like it or not, people watch and often emulate ministers. Unbelievers also watch. They've seen the "what would Jesus do" lapel pins Christians wear. Whether curious or skeptical, they judge professing Christians to be either the real deal or just fakes. Their scrutiny is reserved especially for Christian leaders. How pastors live their sermons validates or invalidates their preaching. If leaders tell their people one thing but do the opposite, they signal their sermon is but a theory that they don't even think works in real life. For example, a pastor needs to consider how his public reaction to an insufficient turnout for church work parties reflects last Sunday's sermon on grace, forgiveness, and patience. How does that blockbuster message on faith influence his reaction to a dismal budget committee's report? What about his reaction to unfair or harsh criticism? And what is the level of his response to the local business that shortchanges him? Quote, "The way we should exercise our influence is not as an authority, but as an example. Our lives should be our sermons. The most inspiring leader is the one whose life speaks louder than his words." End quote. Spiritual leaders also validate or invalidate themselves as shepherds by how they relate to people in general. Are they examples of Jesus in their relationship to the flock? If so, their presence and words are a healing balm. They connect with the hearts of people. Through them, Jesus' love brings comfort and encouragement. Even corrective words find more receptive hearts when pastors exemplify Jesus. On the other hand, nothing seems to wound, confuse, or mislead the flock like a pastor who does not practice what he preaches. In a day of failed role models, the church needs her leaders to be genuine heroes of the faith. The responsibility to lead as Jesus would is fearfully awesome. Not only is the pastor accountable to the chief shepherd, but the task seems overwhelming. That is why even the great Apostle Paul in humble vulnerability requested believers to pray he would do as he should. Quote, "Pray on my behalf, that utterance may be given to me in the opening of my mouth, to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel for which I am an ambassador in chains, that in proclaiming it I may speak boldly as I ought to speak." Ephesians 6:19 and 20. Spiritual leadership by example is not a job for sissies. Even Timothy, a pastor highly recommended by Paul, struggled with timidity. This prompted the apostle to write the following encouragement, quote, "For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. 2 Timothy 1:17. What a blessed promise accompanies the call to lead by example. And what a blessed human resource for the pastor is a supportive and praying church. And we're going to put a virtual bookmark right here and come back next episode for the last chapter in the Peter paradigm, presenting the paradigm to pastors. And as I mentioned in the introduction today, 2 episodes from now, we're going to be digging into part 2 of the book entitled The Saul Syndrome. I trust that these do's and don'ts have given you plenty to gnaw on for a while, so until next episode, God bless.